Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into a specific source you sent our way. It's a YouTube video from Krzysztof Jackowski.
That's right. He talks about his visions, particularly around the recent presidential election and, well, what he sees coming next.
And our goal here is pretty straightforward. We want to unpack the key predictions and, importantly, the interpretations he shares in this video.
Yeah, just pull out the core messages from this particular source, help you get a quick grasp of what he's actually saying, including some surprising details.
Okay, let's get into it then. He apparently starts by looking back, right, at a vision he had before the election about the person who actually won.
Yes, back in September of the previous year, he described this future president in quite specific ways.
Like how? What stood out?
Well, the description was someone who felt like they were pulled from somewhere, not really a career politician, even though they had pious support.
Right. I remember reading he used terms like libertarian, someone who didn't quite fit the usual political boxes.
Exactly. And this idea of appearing from nowhere, sort of unexpectedly, but still managing to beat the more established names.
But there was also that intriguing, slightly worrying element, wasn't there? Something about betrayal.
Yes, Zdrada, that came up in the September vision. And also a warning like, be careful, Uwashush, connected to this person.
Okay, that sounds, well, not great. So how does he explain that now, after the election's over? Did he get it wrong?
Well, this is where his interpretation is key, according to the source. He clarifies that the betrayal and the be careful part, they weren't actually about the president-elect's character.
Oh. So what were they about then?
He says it was reflecting the environment around the candidate during the campaign, the sheer intensity of the attacks, the accusations.
So the hostility towards him.
Precisely. He calls them calumnies, slander, even mentions potential criminal actions by opponents or media. It was that whole negative aura, that intense pressure that's the vision picked up on as betrayal and a reason to be careful.
That's a very different way of looking at it. Not the person betraying, but the situation being treacherous, kind of.
Exactly. It's an interpretation of the vision's signal, not a literal prediction of the person's actions, in his view.
And the source also mentions why Jackowski himself decided to vote for this candidate in the end.
Yes, he does. He said that despite that initial warning in the vision, when he actually observed the candidate, his wife, his daughter, he just got a feeling they were people of honor.
A gut feeling, basically.
Sort of. A personal conviction that they wouldn't betray the people who supported them. That feeling overrode the initial interpretation, or rather, helped clarify the vision's meaning for him.
Interesting. And what about the relationship with the PS party? Did he see the new president just following their lead?
No, he was pretty firm on that. He doesn't believe the president-elect will be a PS pen just signing off on things.
He thinks he'll be independent.
Yeah, he says if PS expects him to be easily controlled, they're in for a surprise. He expects him to show that independent streak right from the start.
Now, there was a listener question in the source from Zarek K, which is a good one. If Jackowski has to kind of reinterpret things like the betrayal warning, why trust the visions at all?
Right, a totally valid point. And Jackowski addresses it. He basically says he does believe his visions, but they're not always, straightforward. They need interpretation.
So the vision was right, but the initial understanding might have been off.
That's how he presents it. He reiterates that the beware part, for him, clearly pointed to the campaign attacks, the calumnies, once he looked back.
Okay. And what about those other campaign claims, like the idea he might pardon gangsters? How did Jackowski see that?
He viewed that as just noise, an aftermath, he called it, of those same campaign slanders, not something he took seriously as a future possibility.
So filtering out the campaign rhetoric from the actual person.
Seems to be, yes. His overall feeling reported in the source was that Poland actually made a good choice.
What about the president's style? The source mentioned him maybe not being fluent in English or not quite Solano-y.
Yes, Solano-y, implying like super smooth and polished in elite circles. Jackowski's take is, okay, maybe he lacks that polish, but he'll be a president of blood and bone.
Reading, more authentic, grounded.
That seems to be the implication, someone real. And crucially, someone who won't betray his own ideals, which Jackowski points out aren't necessarily identical to Pai's party ideals.
Another nod to that independence. And he also found something positive in the election mechanics itself, didn't he?
He did. He pointed to the fact that the win was by a pretty slim margin, right? And the opponent, Trzaskowski, had a lot of support, potentially access to tools that theoretically could be used to mess with results.
But the result held.
Exactly. And Jackowski sees that as evidence. Proof, maybe, that rigging an election in Poland is either extremely hard or maybe just impossible. A good sign for democracy in his view.
Okay, that gives us a good picture of how he views the election in its immediate context. Let's shift gears now. What does the vision suggest is coming during this presidency for Poland and Europe?
All right. Well, first, he mentions trusting the president-elect's promise not to send Polish troops into Ukraine. So a point of reassurance there.
Good to know. But I get the feeling it's not all going to be smooth sailing from here on out in the vision.
Definitely not. The vision suggests the president is going to face two very bad decisions, and potentially quite quickly.
Two bad decisions. What forces those? What happens?
The trigger, according to the vision, is a sudden, very brutal military attack on a European country.
Not Poland specifically, but somewhere in Europe.
Not Poland is the trigger, no. But this attack forces these incredibly tough choices onto the agenda.
Wow. And does this tie back to that betrayal theme we talked about earlier?
In a way, yes, but on a much bigger stage. He talks about a sense in Europe, discussions of politically betraying Europe itself or maybe betraying the country that gets attacked.
A failure of solidarity.
Potentially. And he adds another layer, a vision element, suggesting America might secretly cut some kind of deal with Russia, with Putin.
Whoa. A separate deal.
Yeah, he specifically says this isn't about the current Ukraine situation, but something else, some other arrangement.
So if there's an attack, and maybe deals happening behind the scenes, Europe is left scrambling and divided.
That's exactly the picture painted. Europe trying to respond, but without full unity. Some countries, Poland included, wanting to defend the attacked nation, but others, not so much.
So this presidency is going to be defined by external crises then?
It seems so. Jackowski's words were that the term will be entangled in bad actions happening in Europe and, significantly, entangled in a war that is not ours.
Entangled in a war not ours. But then comes the really startling prediction about how the president's first term ends.
Yes, that's probably the most dramatic part. The vision suggests it ends in exile. Na uchoduswi.
In exile. Does that mean he causes a war that forces him out?
No, he's very careful to clarify that. It's not that the president's actions lead to war in Poland directly. It's that the world gets dragged into a really deep, wide-ranging war.
And that war eventually reaches Poland.
Yes. That global conflict eventually spills over or happens in Poland too, and the exile is a consequence of that situation, not something the president caused in isolation.
Okay, so exile because Poland is engulfed in a larger war. Does the vision give more detail about this war? What does it look like?
It does. He sees it starting during this president's term. It's described as a 2- or 3-front war. One of those fronts will be in Europe, affecting several countries.
And Poland's specific situation within that?
This is quite stark. He sees Poland becoming significantly depopulated, wyludni.
Depopulated?
Yeah.
Through casualties?
Not necessarily, or not primarily. He emphasizes it's more about panic and fear. A sudden mass exodus, people fleeing maybe from specific regions rather than the whole country being overrun initially.
The sudden flight out of fear. Where are the main global fronts he mentioned?
2 main areas he sees being prepared. The Middle East and that whole Russia, Ukraine, Belarus region. He says these will become open fronts.
And that's the start of the World War, in his view.
Yes, when those fronts truly ignite. He even describes how it might start in Poland unexpectedly in the day. People just leaving work, schools, abandoning everything suddenly.
That's a terrifying image. What's the president doing while this is happening?
The vision shows him having to formally declare a state of war in Poland, and he suggests other European leaders might be doing the same around that time.
And he linked the start of this broader conflict back to Ukraine, didn't he?
Yes, specifically. He mentioned it happening after what he termed 3 big attacks by Ukraine against Russia.
And long-range missiles.
Right. He connects Europe and the U.S., giving Ukraine the green light and the weapons themselves to carry out such attacks as being perceived by Russia as direct engagement by Europe and the U.S., essentially crossing a line.
You mentioned European division earlier. Does he say more about who stands where when this bigger war kicks off?
He does. He says when the Middle East and Russia fronts open up, Europe will not be united. He specifically names Hungary, Turkey, Greece, and some Balkan states as countries likely leaning towards Russia, or at least not fully aligned against them.
And Poland's position in all this, strategically?
It looks precarious in his vision. He sees the UK and Germany using Poland as a forward base.
Using Poland. How?
Specifically, he mentions British aircraft flying missions from Poland, not from the UK, which in his view makes Poland an obvious direct target for Russian retaliation.
The difficult position.
Yeah, you say.
Did he give any sense of timing when this might all happen?
He mentioned the year 2028. It's come up repeatedly in his visions related to this, apparently. But he was quick to add he's not certain about that date. It's more of an association he keeps getting.
So a potential marker, but handle with care. Okay. Beyond that huge, dramatic arc, the source mentioned a couple of other smaller visions he shared, seemingly unrelated.
Yeah, just briefly. One was an image of a large wall falling down with metal scaffolding right in front of it as it falls.
Any interpretation offered?
Not really elaborated upon in the source material we looked at, just presented as a distinct image.
Then the other one.
That was about a TV studio. He saw two male politicians actually getting into a physical fight, like hitting each other, causing a massive scandal.
Okay. Definitely separate from the global conflict stuff, just standalone flashes, it seems.
Seems like it. Just other things that came through included in his report.
All right. So reflecting on this deep dive into the Jackowski video you shared,
Yeah.
what are the main things we've pulled out for you?
Well, we've definitely unpacked his unique interpretation of that pre-election betrayal warning, seeing it not about character, but about the toxic campaign environment.
Right. And then we explored the very challenging, quite dramatic future he envisions for this presidency. Entangled in war, facing tough choices, and that startling prediction of the term ending in exile because a wider war reaches Poland.
Yeah, and we got into the specifics of that war vision, the sudden depopulation through panic, the multi-front aspect, the European divisions, and Poland's potential tactical vulnerability.
So the aim here was really to walk you through this one particular source, helping you quickly understand its core claims, and crucially, the interpretations Jackowski himself provides for his own visions.
Exactly, giving you a handle on what this specific piece of material contains.
Which leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. What does this kind of vision, so detailed, so specific, often quite unsettling, dealing with future leadership, conflict, exile, mass panic, what does it tell us? Maybe about the nature of trying to see the future, or maybe just about our current anxieties, or simply how we grapple with uncertainty, something definitely to mull over.